Welcome back everyone to another episode of our Apex build guys, and in today's video we're going to cover Alicia, which is a unit from the recent Valkyria collab that just dropped in the C server. So Alicia is a pretty decent supporting DPS. I call her a supporting DPS because she doesn't exactly bring an overwhelming amount of damage or any unique mechanics to the table. She just does decent damage, she does it well, and she also brings some utility options that can help support her team. So first off, looking at her talent for Scout, increases her attack by 12%, which scales up to 20% at 6 stars, and when moving can pass through enemy units and all passable terrains is considered as plains. So she can pass directly through enemy units, doesn't have to walk around them, and she has an inbuilt terrain master for her entire unit. When passing through units and the surrounding one block, gain a chance to mitigate mobility reduction up to 2 blocks. So this is a very weird and convoluted way of explaining it, but you can basically think of it as she gets bonus mobility when moving near other units, or rather moving through other units, which includes her own teammates, by the way. So this unit, it doesn't specify, so it applies to both friendly and enemy units. And as usual, will explain how this works in practice in a demo in a later section. And finally, for every one enemy unit passed through this turn before using an AoE skill or entering battle, gain intelligence report. Damage dealt increases by 8%, damage taken decreases by 20%. Stackable, last one turn cannot be dispelled and stacks up to 2 times. And it has a cooldown, so this effect can only trigger once every 4 turns. I'm not sure if this is a visual bug or if it's intended, because according to Wikigrisser and the Chinese wiki, it's supposed to be 3 turns at 4 stars, but basically it scales up to 2 turns cooldown at 6 stars. So next, let's look at her unique skills first. So her first unique skill is Gunfire Barrage. It's her 2C single target attack skill. And it's a physical attack. It attacks a single enemy dealing 1.4 times damage and increases critical chance by 20% when using this skill. And this skill can be used 3 times in succession, and after 3 times it turns into reload skill. And this skill restores 50% of the unit's HP and replenishes the 3 charges. And after you reload, you can use the attack again. So just looking at this skill alone, it sounds pretty good because it basically has no cooldown and it has a decent multiplier. But the thing about Alicia is, usually when she initiates or she engages the enemy, it's not very likely for her to survive to unleash follow-up attacks. So I doubt that she can make full use of the potential of this skill, but it does sound pretty broken in PvE, like a no cooldown skill. So okay, moving on, her next skill is Grenade Blast, which is her 2C AoE skill. It only has a 1 turn cooldown, but it has a span of 2 blocks, which is extremely small in Langrisser terms, because span of 2 blocks actually just means a plus shape AoE. So imagine like if this skill is the center, it hits the main target and then the 4 adjacent blocks next to it. So it's a very small AoE. Well, this skill deals a 0.3 times AoE damage and applies a displacement effect, which is all enemies within 1 block of the target are randomly repelled either 1 or 2 blocks. So this skill is mainly, you're not really looking at the AoE damage, you're looking at the utility of the displacement effect. So you can, let's say, like given the earlier example, if you imagine this as the target of the AoE, you click on the center and all these units will get pushed outwards from the center of the AoE, which is pretty unique. We don't really have a skill like this in Langrisser at the moment, I believe. Usually most of the displacement skills are either positioning swaps like Autocrato and Reinforce, or they push in one specific direction. So yeah, this is a pretty unique skill overall, and I can see this catching people off guard if they don't understand this skill well enough. And next up we have her 1C skill, Righteous March, which is her 1 cost skill, and basically it's an act against skill. So after use, dispels 1 debuff from the unit and restores 50% of HP, allowing the unit to move an additional 2 blocks and attack again. So these skills allow her to keep her buff durations, and these skills can be used 3 times in in one battle. So after you use 3 times, you won't be able to use it anymore. But frankly, you won't really make full use of all 3 charges, similar to the Gunfire Barrage skill. But the thing about her Act Again skill, even though it's only 2 blocks, the way it works with her talent is that you will gain this extra mobility with, free mobility for each individual action. So before and after you use the skill, you will get to skip 2 tiles. So this is 4 stars, so I would say 2 tiles. So it's not shared across the entire turn. So she gets bonus 2 from her normal movement, she acts again, then she gets another bonus 2 on top of this additional 2 blocks. So her mobility is pretty high overall if you take that into account. And finally, we're looking at a 3C Azure Sting. Well, I don't really know how to pronounce this properly. It's a physical damage single target attack that does 1.6 times damage and gives her a buff that ignores melee damage penalty for this attack alone. And before battle, this unit restores 100% of HP, dispels 5 buffs from the enemy, and reduces the enemy's defense by 30%. And this debuff lasts 2 turns, cannot be dispelled, and after the battle deals an additional 0.25 times AoE damage to enemy within 4 blocks in the straight line. So there's quite a lot going on in this skill, so not sure why, but this unit has a lot of HP restoring mechanics in her skills. Like, her reload restores 50% of her health, her act again restores 50% of her health, and her 3C restores 100% of her health. So, if she survives a hit, she can kind of just come back and heal a shit ton and do her thing again. But this skill is kind of similar to a Sword Soul with a lower multiplier. Usually, Sword Soul clones have 1.8 times damage multiplier, but you get a Dispel 5 and you get a more generic debuff in the form of minus 30% defense, which is pretty significant if not immunized, because minus 30% is a lot. Like Dark Reaper kind of, but physical version. And the thing about this skill is that it deals an additional AoE skill at the end of the battle. So this skill basically allows her to kill most revive units that aren't tanks. Like Hilda revives at 50% HP, so you can't do that. But things like Elwyn or 20% revive, like Indomitable units like Archon, maybe Crimson, what do you call it? King of Red Moon. I don't know what's his official name already. But those sort of units with 20% HP revives. Lucretia, actually, one of the main targets for this skill. So she gets to kill those revive units with her 3C, which is a pretty good niche to have for a DPS, since she doesn't have a niche as an assassin, as an archer unit, but she does have this going for her, which is being able to kill revive units. So moving on to the next section, her class choice. So looking at her 2 available tier 3 classes, her Scout class and her Shock Trooper class, the pretty obvious option here is to pick the Shock Trooper class because it has a significantly higher amount of HP and defense for a small trade-off of magic defense. But I also want to note here that the Scout class has a hard bond effect that gives her plus 10% damage when the enemy has a debuff. So, which basically means that it always procs with her 3C as long as it's not immunized. So it's one way for her to get an extra bit of damage. But the cost of that is having roughly 600 less base HP, which translates to around more than 1000 lesser in PvP, if you're considering both the base and the percentage HP and chance you get from her gear, which is quite costly, but I wouldn't say it's completely out of the question. So if you really want to maximize on damage, you can consider running the Scout class, but otherwise most people will choose to run the Shock Trooper class. As for her Mastery Stones, I opted to run attack HP skill with double crit in her arena because I want to maximize her DPS potential, but I think it's reasonable to run a attack HP defense with double suffered crit for a more defensive build. because her talent does give her a significant amount of damage taken decrease if you can find a chance to run through a unit before she attacks. And this buff combined with Last Rites, if you can maintain her full HP, can make her quite bulky. So defensive build is actually a possible option to be run in her stones. So to the next section, her soldiers. So her soldier choices are actually pretty poor, but you know, she's an archer character, so she gets mostly archer troops. And archer troops are not exactly known for being the best troops in the game. So her main options here would actually be between Firebrand and Dark Elf Sniper. So Firebrand is what you would run most of the time. It has the most consistent attack stat, and it deals extra fixed damage equal to 15% of the enemy's max HP after battle, which won't be enough to kill revives, but maybe if you're missing out on a kill slightly, the Firebrand Sniper effect can help you secure a kill. Whereas for Dark Elf Sniper, if you are very confident that you will be attacking into a full HP target, this would be your troop of choice. So the other options that I've considered is actually Dwarf Adventurer, because I realized this unit suffers from a complete lack of damage increase. But there's nothing in her talent. Actually, there is in her talent, but I wouldn't say it's the easiest to trigger. It's a very conditional damage increase, and it's not a whole lot either. And she doesn't have damage increase anywhere in her skill. So she just has this minus 30% defense going for her. So I actually tried to do some preliminary tests with Dwarven Adventurer, but the base attack difference with Firebrand, on top of not having any attack percentage for the troop itself, so the damage overall wasn't very convincing. It was roughly the same, and sometimes most of the time actually Firebrand ends up winning because of the extra fixed damage. So it's possible that this troop can have a certain niche in a matchup, but I haven't found it yet. And the rest of her troops are kind of shit. So yeah, you won't really consider those. She has heavy infantry, but she doesn't have a way of allowing them to attack with her at 2 range. So generally you won't really consider it unless you are very certain that you can melee with the troop. Then this troop would actually give her the most survivability out of all the other troops. But yeah, I don't really see that happening with Alicia, unfortunately. So finally we arrive at the equipment section. So well, this is what I'm running, but let me bring up the LDR. So overall, her main set would look something like EMB, Last Rites, King's Crown, and Prisoner's Gear. And the Prisoner's Gear can be, any 8% attack accessory of your choice. So Last Rites and King's Crown is kind of a no-brainer here. I wouldn't even really consider alternatives, because Last Rite, as with all Last Rite users, as long as you can maintain your full health, it's one of the most broken armor in the game. And King's Crown is because it synergizes well with her 1C passive, which is the Accelerated 8. So you boost the mobility of one unit, and you also give them a 20% damage increase buff. So it synergizes quite well as a minor support feature for this unit. And her alternative option is the Bone Bonnet, but this unit has a lot of inbuilt HP recovery in her kit, so you probably won't find much use for the Bone Bonnet other than the base HP, which is not really the defining feature of Alicia. Like, she's not really built to tank, unfortunately, unless you can really satisfy that damage reduction condition. And as for her weapon, we're using EMB over Stinger because EMB allows her to counterattack melee units, because her 3C only has the ignore reduction for when you are using the attack only. So with EMB you can counter other melee attackers and do some decent damage back to them, or even counter kill in certain circumstances, such as flyer units that have slow animations. And the other reason for not running Crystal Stinger is that Crystal Stinger has a diminishing return with her 3C minus defense buff, rather debuff. So I've done a bit of testing and realized that the damage is actually very similar because you're already reducing their damage defense by 30%, so you're reducing a smaller amount of defense when you're using Crystal Stinger. So you get crit and crit damage, but you lose a lot of base attack, and her base attack isn't very high. Her 6-star base attack is around 560, it's not the highest. So overall the attack difference actually ends up roughly the same, but you get the EMB's advantage of being able to counterattack melee units. As for the accessory, you run Prisoner's Gear mostly to secure kills on Elwyn that usually runs outside of guard. And you can use other 8% attack accessories as well, but she probably won't be needing that extra damage against holy units. You know, maybe Cherry if you really want. And similarly with Slayers. Slayers is even worse because she's already an archer unit, so she generally won't be missing kills on flyers that much. So Twilight is the other option, and it's mostly specifically for Werewolves Wereham for lower stars Alicia. Because when you think about Twilight Star, it's mostly to break last rites. And the things that can wear last rites are basically only flyers and assassins. And the only pure assassin class assassins that are running around right now is basically probably something like Kyra and SP Sigma. And if you're worried about those matchups, then sure, you can run the Twilight Star. But Prisoner's Gear also provides some base HP, which helps with her survivability. So this one is up to you which one you want to run. I think Twilight Star is actually a pretty decent option as well. Like, I wouldn't even call it a backup option. I think it can be the main accessory as well. And finally, for the enchant options, you can run, most people choose to run Breeze, but I think Meteor is a possible alternative because, as I mentioned, this unit has a severe lack of damage increase anywhere in her kit. So if you tend to pick mobility supports like IBC earlier on in a draft and you don't think you need the Breeze, +2 mobility, you can opt to run Meteor to try and increase her overall damage potential. But most DPSs would stick to Breeze Enchant, especially because the gear is easier to be shared with other units. Like, if you're gonna run Meteor, you probably have to enchant a set for her alone, basically. Alright, so in order to demonstrate Alicia's skills, we're gonna use this map, which is different from the map that I usually use because this map the enemies tend to clump up a bit more. So first off, let's look at how her talent works. It's phrased as gains a chance to mitigate mobility reduction up to 2 blocks, but that basically means that she gets two tiles that are 0 cost movement, so they don't cost anything, so it's basically free movement, which is basically bonus movement. So, and she gets this chance to ignore mobility when passing through units and the surrounding 1 block. So let's take this Leon for example. So if you run through the tile above him, you will get the bonus ignore unit. Free mobility. And it works for allies as well, so including IBC here. So basically, like, you look at her, she has base 5 mobility now from the IBC +2 mobility buff. So this tile is free. You count, so she uses 1 block here. This is another free. Then she gets 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks of mobility. So she's not passing directly through any other unit, but she still gets the free mobility as long as the tiles are within 1 block of any other unit. So I hope that explains it for her talent, her mobility portion. So next I want to show how her AoE skill actually works. Look at it. If I click here, it's actually a really small AoE. It's just basically the plus shape. And how you would use it is basically something like this. You just put it in between a unit, or between 2 units rather. and they get pushed in opposite directions. So the direction is always fixed, it will be away from the center of the AoE, but they can randomly be pushed away either 1 or 2 blocks. So this skill can be useful either like as demonstrated here when they are standing a little bit further away from the actual tank guarding, or you can also use it when the guard is running out and when the enemy is forced to stay in a cross formation or plus formation. You can just plant the AoE directly on the tank and everyone will get pushed out. So it's one thing that tank push players will have to watch out for when fighting against Alicia, even though she's not an assassin unit. So okay, let's rewind back to before she moved. So in order to demonstrate that her talent actually ignores mobility twice, so here I move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 blocks. So I use up the +2 mobility from her talent. So I click her act again skills, and you realize I can move 4 blocks again. So even though this skill is supposed to only allow you to run an extra 2 blocks, so you refresh the +2 mobility from the talent. So this means that between 4 stars and 5 stars, you actually gain 2 more mobility overall throughout the entire turn, which is a pretty significant buff at 5 stars. But yeah, so basically you skip the tile that this Vargas is currently on, you skip the tile that is above Vargas, and then you get 2 more mobility. So that's how her mobility skip works when you use her act again. And also to further demonstrate how her 3C works, this is actually not a good spot to be in because I can't range attack. So let's say do it like this. So her 3C, you can actually only shoot in a straight line, you can't do it diagonally. And let's say if you attack this Elwyn here, Vargas guards. Afterwards, you will do an AoE that is 4 tiles in the direction that you attacked from. So you can see enemies within 4 blocks in the same straight line, so you can reach the Vargas from where I'm standing here. So to close out for this video, I just kind of want to give my preliminary thoughts on this unit. So the way she functions and her base kit is actually really similar to Helena, and they have a similar problem in that they do not ignore guards. So even though they have a lot of mobility, they actually, they still have to get through the tank if there is a tank on the opponent's team. So their 3Cs are very similar, they do damage, and then they have an additional AoE component to it that allows them to kill revive units. So, but even though they are very similar in those regards, their niches are actually quite different. So it's not suitable for direct comparison. So Helena, her niche is actually the fact that she's innately very bulky due to her exclusive, giving her damage reduction and self-sustain whenever she gets hit by any type of attack. And she also does AoE chip damage with Blood Sword and her passive AoE every turn. And that thing also applies debuffs that will break gear effects if there is no immunity on the other team. Whereas Alicia doesn't really quite have that. Like, her bulk is not nearly as bulky as Helena. Like, she has this damage reduction thing, but it's very inconsistent. It's pretty hard to proc because you need to run through 2 enemies to get it, and then it doesn't have 100% uptime. It has a 2 turns cooldown even at 6 stars. And also she doesn't do as much AoE debuff, so she doesn't have that sort of utility. But in return for that, she gets a significantly stronger single target component in her 3C. So Helena actually suffers from very inconsistent single target damage. Like, she can randomly miss kills. Like, you wouldn't really run a Helena into a Epsilon. You might just straight up die and not kill at all. Whereas I think Alicia, she is much more consistent in the single target killing component, because She dispels 5 buffs and also lowers their defense before battle. So in that regard, she's actually also much more useful when hitting into the tank compared to Helena. Because, you know, just imagine, right, Helena hitting into a Hilda, especially if they have a healer, you do like negative damage, they just heal right back up. Whereas Alicia is a little bit more consistent in that regard, because her Dispel 5 buffs allows her to combo with other tank busters such as Elwyn and Wedam. And dispelling buffs also makes the tank slightly more useless if you manage to dispel their 2-range guard skill, or 2-turn guard buff rather. So she has a bit more, she's not as useless when fighting into a tank when you compare her to Helena in that sense. And she also has a, you know, I actually forgot to mention this during the skills portion of the video, but Accelerated 8 combined with King's Crown makes her a pretty, you know, it's pretty decent support for a single unit that will probably initiate the fight in her place. So yeah, that's a pretty good, like, there's not any other units that has this Accelerated 8 plus King's Crown support combo now at the moment, I think. So other than that, I also want to talk a little bit about the Apex meta overall. So because this month, this patch also has Kruger's exclusive being released. So Kruger together with Alicia, they are both 3 mobility units. I think if people are willing to try them out in the box again, it actually opens up a situation where an early pick for IBC is actually much more viable than it was before, in my opinion at least. So instead of playing Assassins together with Hilda, Autocrator and Rosen as the main 2 draft lines, now you get to pick IBC early, and then you get to, you know, make them decide whether they want to play against Kruger's AoE, or your 3 mobility assassins, or your tank busters in the form of Lucretia and Alicia. You know, I wouldn't really call Alicia a tank buster, but she does pretty decent damage in that regard. And together with other tank busters, you can overwhelm the tank pretty easily, I would say. And other than that, they will also have to consider that, you know, if they ban the 3 mobility units, they will end up fighting Wedam, Elwyn, Ares, you know, all the other 5 mobility units, which will benefit from her Accelerated 8 depending on how the draft goes. So, you know, IBC buffs Alicia, and then Alicia buffs some random flyer or cavalry, and it opens up a pretty flexible dynamic in regards to mobility support in the team, which opens up a much more aggressive style of play as compared to before. So yeah, those are basically what I think about Alicia right now without actually playing any games, because, you know, it's been barely a day since the unit drop and I just wanted to get a video out. So of course I'll be trying her out during the next few weeks, and we will see if my assessment is correct or not. And with that said, thank you guys for watching, hope you all enjoyed. See you in the next video, peace.